Our story kicks off with Inaba Yushir, a young guy who's never believed in monsters or ghosts. To him, those were just silly figments of imagination. His focus was always on real-world problems. The supernatural? Yeah, that was the least of his worries. Then, on the eve of his graduation, we meet his best bud, Jay, a handsome, single, and literally filthy rich student. The complete opposite of Inaba. After class, Jay suggests a friendly brawl to blow off some steam, because, you know, guys have that weird urge to throw down with their brothers sometimes. Inaba figured he'd win, and so did Jay. Yup, these guys were serious about it. Inaba threw the first punch, but Jay countered by tossing his jacket and delivering a fierce kick. The brawl quickly became a test of strength between the two, leaving both exhausted and sore, but with their friendship even stronger. At the end of the fight, Jay extended his hand to congratulate Inaba on getting into Ju High. Inaba, grateful, returned the gesture, knowing his buddy was the top student in their class with a bright future ahead, even aspiring to become an elite entrepreneur in Japan. But Inaba had different plans for his future. When spring arrived, Inaba started his new life at Yodo High. He was thrilled about finally living on his own in a dorm, a dream he'd had for a long time. This also meant leaving his uncle's house, where he'd been living. But fate had other plans. A devastating fire destroyed the dorms at his new school, along with his dreams. With nowhere to stay, Inaba had to find an apartment on his own. The problem? His budget was a measly 30,000 yen, basically $10 and a half-eaten empanada. Desperately, he spent the whole day searching for a place. Sitting in the park, he remembered his uncle's words, it would take months to rebuild the dorms. Though his aunt tried to comfort him, Inaba was overwhelmed by uncertainty. Things got even more complicated when his cousin Eriko expressed her displeasure at the idea of sharing the house with him, showing her disapproval by slamming the table. Determined to solve his problem on his own, Inaba felt lost and cursed his bad luck. Just then, something surprising happened. A ball bounced his way, catching his attention. A strange kid with a ghostly aura approached him, asking if he was looking for an apartment. The kid pointed to a nearby building called Maeda Real Estate before disappearing without a trace. Showing no fear, Inaba entered the building and found an old man, casually reading the newspaper and smoking. Inaba tried to speak with him, and the man, turning around, greeted him in a laid-back manner. Inaba shared his story, and the man sympathized with the situation at his school. The old man offered a solution, telling him about a room available near his school, a 15-square-meter room with a 3-door closet and a southern view. It had a shared bathroom but included meals and other amenities, all for the low price of 25,000 yen, which was 5,000 yen less than Inaba had in his pocket. Inaba was stunned by the offer, wondering if it was real and whether he'd still have all his organs after the first night. The landlord jokingly mentioned that the place was so cheap because it was haunted, but Inaba decided to take the offer anyway, like the typical horror movie protagonist who ignores all the warnings. The next day, the landlord took Inaba to his new home, a creepy-looking inn called Kotobuki. Together, they opened the door to the inn and were greeted by darkness, climbing the stairs as Inaba felt the unsettling sensation of being watched. Despite the unease, they continued to what would be his new home. When they finally reached the room, the landlord handed Inaba the key. Inaba, unable to hide his excitement at having a place of his own, opened the door and found an even bigger surprise, a library with a book by his favorite author, Shiki. The landlord asked if he liked the author, mentioning that he was quite old-fashioned. Inaba replied that his friend Hassel had lent him a Shiki book in the past, and since then, he'd become his favorite author, finding his works refined, even if they were grotesque. As the landlord continued talking, Inaba noticed a significant difference in the author's photo on the book's back cover. Looking up, he realized that the real Shiki was standing right in front of him. Inaba was completely shocked to find himself face-to-face with the author of his favorite book. Shiki revealed that he'd been living in the building for over a decade, though others still considered him new to the inn. Inaba was thrilled at the idea of living in the same building as a writer he admired so much. Just then, a beautiful girl named Kainkuga entered, looking for Shiki. Inaba couldn't help but drool at her beauty and was surprised to learn that this stunning and outgoing girl lived alone in the inn. Yeah, Inaba was a bit worried for her safety. After all, the inn wasn't exactly the most pleasant place. So here's the deal, Kain seems totally chill living in this creepy old inn, even calling it a fun place to be. She offers to help Inaba unpack and get settled, and while they're going through his stuff, she stumbles upon some mysterious urns. Inaba, a bit somber, explains that these are the ashes of his parents, who tragically died in an accident 3 years ago. After that, he had to live with his modest, struggling uncle and aunt, which made his cousin Eriko pretty hostile. She'd always blamed him for their family's financial struggles, so it's no wonder Inaba dreamed of getting out on his own, just like any other guy his age. Hearing this, Kine gives him a comforting hug and tells him everything's going to be okay, despite his family troubles. Later, during dinner, Inaba's pleasantly surprised to find the food is absolutely delicious. Kine praises the chef, Ruriko, saying she always serves amazing meals at the inn. But as Inaba is about to dig in, he notices something weird. Ruriko's cooking in total darkness. And then, out of nowhere, a freaking weeping woman casually sits down next to a kid to eat as if it's the most normal thing in the world. That's when it hits Inaba, oh crap, this inn is crawling with monsters and yokai. By nightfall, he's feeling all kinds of uneasy and asks Kine if everyone in the cafeteria actually lives at the inn. She casually explains that most of them are, in fact, his neighbors, and that the dining hall is like a hangout spot for them. And yeah, the food's free, though some might say it's to die for. Inaba is totally intrigued, but before he can ask more, Kine suddenly says she has to rush off to work at a hospital. At midnight, Inaba's like, wait, what? But Kine just leaves without giving him any more details. Confused and remembering the landlord's warnings about the ghosts, Inaba's still skeptical, brushing it off with a nervous laugh. But his doubt starts to crack when he hears noises coming from one of the rooms. Curiosity gets the best of him, so he decides to check it out. But as he tries to greet whoever's inside, everything turns dark and creepy. In the shadows, he sees demonic figures closing in on him, sending him into full-on panic mode. He tries to flee but ends up in another room where he finds that same strange kid from dinner, staring blankly at a TV playing nothing but static. Next to him is a white dog that's slowly fading away. Inaba's totally mesmerized by the bizarre scene and doesn't even notice Shiki sneaking up on him. When Shiki finally taps him on the shoulder, Inaba lets out a blood-curdling scream and collapses to the floor. Shiki, taken aback, asks why Inaba's so freaked out and what's going on. Still shaking, Inaba can only mumble his name. Trying to calm him down, Shiki suggests he take a bath, mentioning that the basement bath is top-notch. Reluctantly, Inaba agrees and follows Shiki downstairs, but before he can even get in, another terrifying monster pops out, scaring him so bad he faints on the spot. The next day, Inaba meets up with his friend Jay at the train station and tells him all about his horrible nightmare. Jay, always the joker, grabs Inaba's hand and says, if you wanted to see a monster, you've got one right in front of you. Then transforms into a freaking demon. Yep, just to cap things off, Inaba realizes it was all just a nightmare. Or was it? He bolts out of his room, only to run straight into Shiki, who finally drops the bomb we all saw coming. The inn is haunted. Surprise, surprise, right? Just then, Kine returns from work and gets attacked by a dark, menacing spirit. Inaba tries to help, but he's too frozen with fear to do anything. But, plot twist, Kine turns out to be an exorcist. With some seriously epic moves, she exorcises the spirit right in front of Inaba, who finally realizes that ghosts and monsters are very real and that this creepy inn is their sanctuary. His life has just taken a wild turn, for better or worse. After that insane night, Inaba decides to write a letter to his buddy Jay to update him on everything. As he writes, we see a flashback of how he lost his parents at a young age and how he's now living in a place where monsters and humans coexist. But then he thinks better of it and tears up the part about the monsters. Back in the inn's dining hall, Shiki and Kine notice how stressed Inaba looks and ask if everything's okay, trying to put him at ease. Inaba and Kine start making a list of the residents at the inn, figuring out who's human and who's a ghost. While they're at it, Inaba overhears two dudes talking, and one of them gets sent to some fancy corporate training. But then, Inaba nearly spits out his food when he sees the same kid who vanished before. Yep, the one who tossed the ball at him. Inaba decides to approach the guys to make sure they're actually human. Right then, Kine explains that the inn has this barrier that keeps the spirits of the dead stable, letting them touch and see things they couldn't before. She also mentions something about mysterious dimensions and points in the inn, but Inaba's still not getting it, just like me. Then Shiki pops the question, has Inaba made up his mind? And yep, Inaba says he's sticking around the inn for the 6 months while his school dorms get rebuilt. Kine hears this and, guess what? The inn chef whips up a cake to celebrate. Though, we only see the chef's hand doing this kinda act, kinda weird, but hey, who turns down cake? Especially not a ghost. On his first day of high school, Inaba's watching his classmates, feeling totally out of place knowing he's not exactly a normal guy. This catches the eye of Takanaka, a classmate who approaches him in a peculiar way, trying to befriend him. After meeting his quirky new buddy, Inaba heads back to the inn, gearing up for the long 6 months ahead. Yep, they sound like an eternity, especially when he walks into the inn and it's pitch black and creepy, contrasting with this sweet, warm voice welcoming him. Shiki reveals to our protagonist that the voice belongs to Hanako, a friendly presence who always says hello. Shiki assures Inaba that he'll soon be able to see Hanako, though seeing more dead people is the last thing Inaba wants. But Shiki tells him not to worry, everyone at the inn is now his new buddy, and no one's gonna steal his soul, or anything like that, for now. Suddenly, we meet another neighbor, Akira, a red-haired guy with a wolf who wastes no time threatening Inaba, warning him not to cause any trouble at the inn. Then, out of nowhere, this old dude with a pirate vibe and an eye patch shows up, trying to sell Inaba a unicorn horn that supposedly wards off bad vibes and solves problems. Yep, this guy's like a mystical Herbalife salesman. Inaba rejects the guy's pitch multiple times, which leads Shiki to smack him over the head with a book. The old man retreats with his 2 tiny assistants, but not before telling Inaba that if he needs anything, he's got him covered. During dinner, we meet a drunk and, well-endowed woman who looks young but is actually super old. She immediately jumps on Inaba, telling him she can't go to heaven yet because of some unfinished business, then tries to suffocate him with her, assets. Inaba manages to escape, saving himself from a tasty but deadly fate. Though, let's be real, who in their right mind wouldn't want to be smothered by ghostly boobs? Speaking of tasty things, a psychic named Ryo shows up at the inn, his presence so intense that all the monsters bow down to him. Ryo talks about the massive amount of monsters at the inn and explains that the place is like an oasis for them. He then dives deep into how humans have lost their connection to the mysteries of the world. Inaba starts to get a better grasp of the situation, but Ryo tells him not to expect typical psychic answers, more like philosophical reflections on life and coexistence. Yep, this dude's on a whole other level. The next day, while Inaba's waiting for the bus to school, Kine reveals that her name isn't actually real, and that psychics and exorcists hide their true names. She also drops that she's an apprentice at Sukin-Nuki Hospital, which, of course, is a hospital for monsters. At school, Takanaka invites Inaba to hang out, mentioning that he knows a cool spot. Inaba feels too awkward to decline, but his new friend Tashiro swoops in, inviting him to the English club instead. Inaba gladly accepts, and they head off together. During their conversation, Inaba realizes that girls like Tashiro and Kine talk to him naturally, which surprises him since, as he admits, his social skills are basically non-existent, except for interacting with his cousin, who always got annoyed when he got too close. Inaba then has a flashback of his friend Hike and how his life changed after losing his parents. He lost the ability to smile and wasn't the same anymore. Now, in his new high school, he wonders if he's going through a change himself. After classes, Inaba says goodbye to Tashiro, and just then, he has a strange vision of his friend getting hit by a car. Worried, he decides to follow her, determined to see if the vision comes true. Inaba grabs Tashiro's hand, awakening a healing power that saves her life and absorbs her pain. Inaba is overwhelmed by Tashiro's pain, which manifests as a dark, dense aura in his body, but it's eventually purified by Kine, who just happened to be passing by. During dinner, Inaba finds himself hungrier than usual, which Kine attributes to his earlier injury absorption. She then explains that Inaba has awakened a supernatural ability to absorb and heal injuries. After that revelation, Inaba visits Tashiro to thank her for saving his life and making her feel better, all while holding her hand tightly. In that moment, Inaba starts to realize he has special powers. The next day, Ha receives a letter from Inaba asking how she's doing and sharing that summer vacation has begun. Inaba reveals that he got a job at a delivery company. Meanwhile, back at the inn, Inaba meets Kane, a white wolf with stripes who could be considered the mother figure to Kuri, the TV boy, and Shiro, his little dog. Kane reveals that she's a spiritual beast who has been taking care of Kuri and Shiro, and shares the sad story of Kuri, who was killed by his own mother in a fit of rage. Shiro, in an act of vengeance, tore out the mother's throat, but the neighbors, seeing this, ended up beating the poor innocent dog to death, who was only trying to protect his young owner. Since then, Kuri's mother has been haunting him, tormenting his soul even after death. Inaba asks if there's anything that can be done to help Kuri's mother, and Kane explains that getting rid of her would be easy, but it wouldn't save Kuri, as his mother's madness has literally cursed him. As long as she exists, Kuri can't move on to the afterlife. Inaba feels bad for Kuri and decides to stay to face the situation. At that moment, Kane reveals that Kuri's mother's vengeful spirit could appear at any moment, so they prepare to face her by throwing a kind of party to lure her out. However, our spectral pals assure Inaba that there's nothing to worry about since the inn is surrounded by a barrier that keeps out evil spirits. Sure enough, the mother shows up, causing Kane to go berserk, acting like a rabid dog. Inaba is shocked by how terrifying Kuri's mother is and tries to stop her, but Akira tells him to calm down since the mother isn't human. Everything ends when Kane takes down the mother's spirit with a powerful lightning bolt from her hand. With everything calm, Kuri and Inaba head to Akine's room, where our protagonist questions the boy's mother, seeing himself reflected in the boy, which brings him to tears until he falls asleep, missing his deceased parents. To rub salt in the wound, Inaba has a dream where his parents are alive, and he's attending high school with his friend Jay. When he wakes up, he realizes he's in his room and everything seems normal. However, no one forgets what happened the night before, and everyone is worried, even though they're accepting the reality. Inaba feels uncomfortable, especially when he realizes he fell asleep from crying so much that Akira had to carry him to his room like a baby. Another day passes, and in the dining room, Akine approaches Inaba and suggests the idea of throwing a farewell party since summer vacation is coming to an end. Inaba happily agrees, knowing that September is approaching, which means he'll have to leave the House of Monsters. While reflecting on this, he hears Takanaka's voice at the inn's entrance, realizing he's accompanied by a group of troublemakers. Takanaka walks in like he owns the place, but Inaba tries to stop him, pushing him and asking what he's up to. Takanaka, mockingly, responds that he and his friends just came to have a good time and laughs in his face. Then, Takanaka mentions Ruriko, the chef with the nervous hands, and suggests trying some of her food. While drinking, one of the friends comments that the building looks like a dump and would probably go up in flames with a single match. Seeing that all the ghosts were scared, Inaba tells them they're drunk and should leave. Takanaka asks if he isn't tired of playing the saint, working, and studying all the time. Inaba doesn't like their attitude and grabs Takanaka to try and kick him out. However, since he wasn't alone, Takanaka's friends threaten Inaba. Being the good person he is, Inaba finally lets him go, telling him his life depends on working and studying, unlike Takanaka, who's just a lazy bum. The situation gets more and more tense until Inaba loses his patience and punches Takanaka so hard that he manages to throw him out of the inn. Takanaka's friends grab him and prepare to beat him up, but at that moment, the antiquarian and Name show up to give moral support. While Takanaka's friends are delivering a brutal beating, a deep, eerie voice tells them to stop. Demon-like figures appear, and one of them warns Takanaka to knock it off, pointing towards the trees where some red, spectral eyes appear. At the same time, Y steps out of the house in a disturbingly friendly way and tells them they shouldn't mess with certain things. Takanaka, backing up, bumps into Akira, who terrifyingly asks what they're doing in his garden, then proceeds to beat them up, warning them that kids shouldn't be smoking or drinking and that he'll punish them. Inaba watches as Akira beats up Takanaka's friends, who finally run away, but Takanaka stays a bit longer, glaring at Inaba before running off too. Akira approaches Inaba and tells him he's become less of a wimp, which makes him happy. After everything that happened, they continue celebrating the farewell party at the inn. So he offers Inaba some juice and gives him a kiss on the cheek, making him blush. Everything seems fine, and with the help of her messengers, Akane sends food to the residents, along with some for Inaba, thanking him for his help and assuring him he won't be forgotten. Finally, September arrives, and Inaba leaves the Monster Inn. After leaving, Inaba starts his second semester and moves into a new dorm where everything is new. There, Inaba met Hiroyuki Isi, a student a year younger than him at the high school, and his new roommate. While they were chatting, another roommate, Kyukaga, showed up and turned out to be in the same dorm as Inaba. As Inaba and Isi headed to grab some food, Isi paused to use the restroom, and Inaba noticed a guy who seemed worried and decided to help him. In that moment, He started to question if his relationships with his new companions were shallow, not as warm as his old Yoki friends. While at the cafeteria, ISI commented that the food was delicious, but Inaba didn't find it as tasty as the chef with the white hands cooking. Inaba remembered what ISI had told him about the chef, how she had dreamed of opening a restaurant before she died. She had quit her job as a hostess and was about to open her restaurant when an old client brutally murdered her, leaving her dismembered. The last thing she saw were her pale white hands, and that's why only her hands appeared at the end. Inaba realized that the chef prepared each dish with love for her customers, which made him reflect on his own life and how it felt like he was living with his uncle again, which weighed heavily on him. One day, while Inaba was running, he ran into Takanaka, who had something on his face. Inaba thought he'd been beaten up and tried to help, but Takanaka pushed him away angrily and ran off. Inaba was left deep in thought in his room, and when he tried to talk to Romi about what had happened, Romi ignored him, turning his back on him, confirming that their relationship was indeed superficial. Despite Inaba's worries, his school life continued smoothly, though he kept wondering if he was really doing what he wanted. At work, Inaba heard news about the arrest of some traffickers, and one of them turned out to be none other than Takanaka. At school, everyone was talking about what had happened, while Inaba wondered if listening to Takanaka more could have changed his fate, feeling guilty for having ignored him all this time. Jay checked his mailbox, hoping for a letter from Inaba, but found nothing. Meanwhile, Inaba felt the urge to run back to the Monster Inn to see his old friends again, but something was holding him back, making him feel like he was on the other side, cut off from that spiritual world he once belonged to. Even during the winter break, Inaba's life remained monotonous, and he began to question if the Monster Inn and the months he spent there had really happened. It was hard to believe amidst his daily routine. On a regular day at school, Inaba mentioned to Tashiro that he already had a list of props for the play they were preparing. Tashiro noticed a change in his attitude and told him that he'd been acting strangely lately, like he was trying too hard. Inaba, in a serious tone, replied that he'd always been like that. Suddenly, Inaba felt a shadow looming over him, reminding him of his old Yoki friends, wondering how they were doing without him and questioning if he'd ever feel happy in his new dorm like he did at the inn. And let me tell you, today's not that day. Inaba invited Kaga to eat at a restaurant that served his favorite food, but Kaga coldly rejected him, saying he didn't care what he ate and that Inaba shouldn't worry about it. Inaba got upset and argued with Kaga, causing him to leave. As the days passed, the memories of the Monster Inn became more distant, and Inaba constantly questioned whether the normal life he was leading now was really what he wanted. One day, Inaba heard a man talking to some women on the street. The man invited him to grab a drink, and when Inaba got closer, he realized it was Sato, a yokai who lived at the Monster Inn. Sato greeted him and mentioned that everyone at the inn was asking about him. Inaba was surprised and excited to hear this. Inaba and Sato went out to eat together at a restaurant. Sato shared that he had worked at a cosmetics company, WAR, for 20 years and was now the manager. Inaba realized that Sato was a yokai living among humans and working at a human company. Sato revealed that he had always wished he could be born as a human to live a fuller life, get married, and live a normal life. Sato's words filled Inaba with nostalgia, and he started to cry. Sato comforted him, saying that young people are the ones who create the future and that even the negative parts of oneself are human and can't be erased, but they can change over time. He reminded Inaba that he had the right to be human and to seek his own happiness. The next day, Jay's family asked him about Inaba. Jay knew that Inaba had stopped showing his vulnerabilities since the death of his parents but had always felt that his friend was hiding something. Jay's father advised him to believe in Inaba and wait. Just then, the phone rang, and Jay's father revealed that it was Inaba calling. Jay felt excited and rushed to meet his friend. Inaba and Jay met at a cafe and caught up on their lives. Inaba told Jay that it was important to talk to people face to face, and Jay replied that some people have difficulty communicating because of their differences, but that doesn't mean they don't want to listen to others' ideas. Jay advised Inaba to get to know people better to understand his own principles and values more clearly. Jay shared his plan with Inaba, which involved being better than his father and teaching his sister who the leader was. To achieve this, he needed to surround himself with good people and had met someone at a neighboring school who could help him. They said their goodbyes, and Jay asked Inaba to write more letters. Inaba saw in Jay a great support. Back in his room, Inaba noticed he had a visitor. It was Eriko, his cousin, doing what she does best, scolding him, this time for not attending his parents' funeral 3 years ago and for not showing up for New Year's. Yeah, she had been holding on to that one. After that, she asked him if he planned to return. Eriko's attitude surprised Inaba, as she usually showed hostility towards him. Eriko handed him the first postcard Inaba had sent from the Monster Inn, in which he wrote that the people at the inn were interesting and that the cook was good. Eriko noticed that Inaba seemed to be hiding his true feelings to avoid problems. She began to cry, expressing her sadness over feeling that her life was miserable with her family. She apologized to Inaba, who felt an immense relief, as the barrier he had built around himself finally broke down. Inaba accepted Eriko's apology, thinking about how much his Yoki friends had helped him grow as a person, knowing that his old self would have reacted negatively to his cousin. And honestly, you can't blame him, she could be a real pain. They finally said their goodbyes with affection, promising to get to know each other a little better. This canonical event led Inaba to decide to return to the Monster Inn to discover more about himself and improve as a person. So, he headed to his dorm, packed his bags, and went back to the inn. Upon opening the door, he was joyfully welcomed by all his ghostly companions, including Hanako, who appeared for the first time. The next day, in the Monster Inn, everyone was in the dining hall when a person arrived with a trunk, someone they called the bookseller. Inaba didn't know what to say, so AIC explained that the bookseller was an inhabitant they hadn't seen in over a year. And guess what? He sells books. Yes, yes, yes. But not just any books, magical ones. However, as Inaba listened to his stories, he felt that the bookseller might be exaggerating a bit about his travels and adventures, which, of course, had taken him from Africa to the Middle East, selling rare books. The bookseller asked who Inaba was, and his response was slow to come, frustrating Inaba. Later, our buddies gathered again with the bookseller, who showed them his collection of ancient books. One of them particularly caught Inaba's attention when suddenly AIC sensed a strange aura from that very book. When they opened it, they found 22 tarot cards with strange names and ancient writing. Yes, those same little cards that appear in the yo-yos. AIC suspected that the book might be sealed and that it possessed powers that had been suppressed so they couldn't be used. Hearing this, the bookseller got excited because he thought the book could be worth a lot of money. However, Inaba took the book to show it to his exorcist master, who turned out to be the boss at the hospital. Afterward, Inaba decided to take a bath in the hot springs at the inn when suddenly, out of nowhere, Hanako appeared in the bath, completely naked, giving our dear friend Shirokuri a bit of a surprise. After that fun little moment, they all ended up bathing together in the bath. After a long day, Inaba felt exhausted but happy about his upcoming meeting with his friend Jas. However, in the middle of the night, Inaba was awakened by a light coming from the mysterious book we had seen earlier. Suddenly, a parrot emerged from the book, introducing himself as Inayurius the Fool. Inaba thought it was a dream, but Inayurius showed him a card called the Fool and revealed that the book was a Hairu Io containing 22 magical monsters, absolutely broken. He also revealed that the book had chosen Inaba to be its master and lord of all of them, including Jin, an omnipotent spirit similar to a genie in a lamp, capable of granting any wish. Inaba decided to put it to the test by asking for money, but he only got a 500 yen coin. Well, at least it delivered. Then Inaba summoned the spirit of the priestess Shil, the goddess of sound, who, instead of surprising him, just ended up shattering the only window in the room. Finally, he tried summoning the hermit but only got an old man napping. Inaba felt like he was wasting his time and went back to bed, thinking the book was just full of mystical nonsense. The next day, Inaba met up with his dear friend Jay and they caught up on their lives. While they were outside, they saw a gang of bikers harassing a waiter at a cafe. As they left the place, Inaba mentioned his return to the Monster Inn. Jay was happy for him, and Inaba encouraged him to visit the inn. Just then, the men who had harassed the waiter reappeared, blocking Jas and Inaba's way. Jay tried to ignore them, but the men wouldn't let them pass and finally tried to attack them. In response, Jay dodged and countered, throwing one of the men onto the motorcycles, leaving them in shock. Jas and Inaba ran towards a nearby construction site to hide. At that moment, Inayurius appeared, and Jas was petrified upon seeing the mystical parrot. Jay, not knowing how to react to Inayurius' appearance, asked if the parrot was a robot. Inaba apologized for thinking it was all a dream and revealed that the book contained sealed spirits, a revelation that only confused Jay more. Inaba decided to use the book and summon Cerberus, but instead of a fearsome three-headed dog, a puppy appeared. Then he called for the hippogriff, a magical horse of the gods, but it just flew away. Inaba then used the spirits of the water goddesses Yaka and the god of lightning, successfully electrocuting the bikers by combining water with lightning. Back at the Monster Inn, Inaba invited Jas to come inside, but he refused and said goodbye. Upon entering the inn, Kina informed Inaba that the Book of Seals had been lost, but Inaba revealed that he had it. Inaba felt reunited with his power, but Kina reminded him that he had saved Toshiro and that his life had been anything but normal since arriving at the inn. Inaba asked the bookseller if he could buy the book, but the bookseller decided to give it to him as a gift. His friends asked him about the kinds of monsters he had summoned, and Inaba replied that they weren't very impressive. Inaba called on Eniurius, and the others asked him to summon Death, possibly the most terrifying-looking card in the whole book. Thus, the imposing Grim Reaper appeared, only to reveal himself as a dwarf in a hood. Literally, everyone was disappointed, and our big shot protagonist decided to go drink some Spirit UAL beverages with his ghost friends. During this, Sakina explained to Inaba that the Book of Seals absorbs the energy of the person who possesses it and recommended that he undergo training to increase his spiritual energy. Inaba felt frustrated by the lack of respect for his decisions and wished to live a normal life as a high school student and future entrepreneur, completely distant from magic. This continued with Inaba waking up at 5 a.m. to begin his training, which, to top it off, consisted of being doused with cold water from a hose while reciting a mantra for 2 freaking hours. However, Inaba feels that time has passed quickly. Kina tells him that he was in a meditative state called a trance. Later in the afternoon, Aina hands Inaba a written script and asks him to recite it. As Inaba begins reciting it and enters his trance, he notices the letters lifting off the page, and everything seems to spin around him. Upon awakening, he realizes that 5 hours have passed and his body is sore. He asks the bookseller to take him to rest in his room. Meanwhile, Inaba receives a call from Jay, who informs him that he will come to the inn the next day. The following day, Jay arrives at the Monster Inn with gifts for everyone and meets Kina, Kira, and Ishiki. Inaba worries about how Jay will react to his new life, but is surprised to see that his friends get along well with everyone. Jas is invited to dinner and to the sect, and Inaba is happy to see Jay adapting as well. During dinner, a strong earthquake occurs at the Monster Inn, and the bookseller asks everyone to stay away from his suitcase, from which the heads of mummies emerge. Inaba prepares to use his book, but the bookseller intervenes and uses a book called 7 Sage to defeat the mummies. Inaba is astonished, and the bookseller explains that he is an expert in strange and rare books and that wizards like them make contracts with books to gain power. The bookseller reveals that his 7 Sage book contains the power of 7 wizards and can be used according to its owner's will. He mocks Inaba for not knowing how to defend himself and explains that those who wield the power of books are known as Lords of the Books. After this revelation, Inaba feels humiliated and unsure of what to say. At night, Jay is visibly shaken by what he witnessed with the mummy heads, and Inaba realizes that his friend is experiencing the same feelings he did at first. He hugs Jay, thanking him for being his friend. Then, Kari arrives and asks to sleep with them. At that moment, he jokes that it feels like they are a family, with him as the father and Inaba as the mother, which scandalizes the protagonist for obvious reasons. Suddenly, the commotion wakes Kari, who begins to cry. Eniurius suggests summoning Cyrene, a spirit who sings magical songs, and she sings a melody that makes Kari and the others fall asleep. The next morning, Jay says goodbye to Inaba and the Monster Inn residents. Inaba, who had been worried about Jay's reaction to his new life, is happy to see that his friend has accepted it. After this, Inaba continues with his training with Kina and notices that Kari is sleeping. Kina tells him that she feels lonely and Inaba reassures her that her father will return soon, which makes Kina laugh. It seems that the family game has grown on the protagonist, and Inaba continues with his training to become a mage, though he is unsure if he wants to follow this path since it means constantly fighting monsters. Later, on his way to high school, Inaba reflects on how it's his first time attending school since returning to the Monster Inn. At school, Toshiro greets him enthusiastically and notes that they are in the same year, the same club, and the same class, which Toshiro considers a matter of destiny. Toshiro also notices that Inaba has lost weight, attributing it to his magical training. Up to that moment, Inaba feels that the only difference in his life is the presence of a new English teacher named Kamara Miura. Although Inaba finds it difficult to approach him, upon leaving the classroom, he notices that Professor Miura was staring out the window with a grim expression. Inaba decides to investigate what the professor was looking at and realizes he was fixating on a group of girls training. However, when he turns back to look, the professor's gaze is unsettling and psychopathic, which makes Inaba feel an uncomfortable sensation and decide to stay away from him. After this incident, Inaba returns to his daily life as a second-year student. The Golden Week passes without problems, and during his quiet time, Inaba enters his room and sees Curry playing Nintendo with Jas. Jas is becoming more comfortable at the Monster Inn and spends his free days there. However, the situation becomes serious when Ryo appears and Inaba explains what happened with the bookseller. Ryo mentions that his current book is not the original one. Later, our friends meet with the bookseller in the hot springs of the inn, where Inaba notices a sword scar on Ryo's shoulder. The bookseller reveals that it was caused by the Jousas, who are problematic since spirits often help them solve crimes. The protagonist's question triggers a series of anecdotes between the bookseller and Ryo, who seem to be very close mages. The bookseller recounts an incident in the Midwest of the United States where a cult sacrificed people and burned them alive while their followers devoured them. Ryo adds that they would cut them up and eat them. At that time, there was a shootout when Ryo and the federal police attempted to stop them, but the cult blew up the building, resulting in everyone's death. Ryo comments that the mission didn't go as planned, but they managed to save some hostages. The bookseller mocks Ryo for always getting injured, and Ryo reminds him of the time he couldn't get a sacred Texas due to bandits in Peru. Inaba and Jay are left speechless by these stories. Back in his room, Inaba is startled by the eye of a giant ogre who turns out to be another friendly neighbor named Matayurisu. They have a dinner for all the residents, and Inaba observes around and feels that everything is very strange. He realizes that Matayurisu is at the heart of it all and that people change over time. He also asks him to start accepting his new life, and Inaba understands that he cannot return to his previous life but can find a way to combine both worlds. The next day, Inaba notices something strange happening at his high school, which is confirmed when Tashiro informs him that there is a ghost at school, leaving Inaba perplexed and unsure how to respond. Meanwhile, at the high school, Tashiro mentions that the storage room where they keep the theater club's equipment has heard voices at night and feels someone watching them when they enter. Inayuria speaks, and one of Tashiro's friends hears a voice, which makes Inaba nervous. Tashiro and his friends start searching Inaba for what he might be hiding, touching him everywhere. At that moment, the English teacher enters the classroom abruptly and scolds him for flirting with the protagonist. The girls are scared, and Inaba is surprised by the teacher's behavior. One of Tashiro's friends doesn't understand what flirting means, and Tashiro, to cover up, says it means having sex, without any clue about what he's talking about. Meanwhile, Inaba feels that something is wrong with the teacher. After this, Inaba goes up to the rooftop and, checking that he's alone, calls Inayurius and asks him to appear. Inayurius suggests that he believe in ghosts and encourages him to use the book. Inaba takes out a divination card called The Rules of Fortune, and 3 fairies dressed as schoolgirls appear. Inaba asks them about the history of the school, but one of the fairies starts criticizing his outfit, disregarding what the protagonist asked. After this criticism, the fairies reveal something that intrigues him, saying that the school is dirty and full of mud. Inaba doesn't understand what they mean, so he decides not to give it much importance. In the afternoon, Inaba attends his English class, but the teacher doesn't seem to be the same person who scolded him earlier. Tashiro and he discuss the strange change in attitude, and Tashiro promises to let him know if he discovers anything unusual. Inayurius tells Inaba it's time to investigate. When the English teacher leaves the classroom, 3 students confront him and intimidate him, jealous of the attention he received from the girls. Inaba decides to confront one of the students but receives a kick to the back and stumbles. He then decides to scare the students using the book and summons lightning that expels them all. At night at the inn, his friends laugh about what happened at school. Akira comments that the students were jealous of him and advises that showing emotions is important when you're young to avoid becoming an insensitive wall. The next day, Inaba goes to the auditorium to continue his investigation, where he finds Tashiro. Inaba asks why he is there, and Tashiro says he is just investigating. Together, they decide to continue their investigation into the storage room where the students feel watched. Upon arriving at the storage room, Inaba notes a dark aura and heavy air. They find a box stuck to the wall with insults toward women written as seals. Inaba realizes that someone might have been watching the girls through the window while writing the insults. Inaba feels that something is wrong, and the air becomes dense. Toshiro concludes that the ghost story started recently. As they are about to discover more, the English teacher appears and confronts them, asking what they are doing. In a fit of euphoria, the teacher grabs Toshiro by the neck. Suddenly, the word misogynist emerges from the seal and enters the teacher's head, who, completely deranged, throws Toshiro towards Inaba with immense force. When Toshiro and Inaba get up, they realize Toshiro has disappeared, and Inaba is stunned by what happened, questioning where the teacher got such strength and why those words seem to possess him. He notices that Toshiro is injured, but she gets up by herself and runs after the teacher. Later, Inaba finds himself in the basement with Inayurius and decides to call the divination fairies again for more information. They tell him that the spirit that was present has left, which Inaba finds hard to believe since he just saw it. Inaba calls Chalkman, the owl, to ask about the negative energy he felt in the storage room. Chalkman explains that it could be a portal to the demon world where negative energy flows, and such portals do not open easily. They also mention that it could be related to memories, like those involving a room called the Room of the Massacre in a castle where a passionate murder occurred. Inaba asks if hatred and curses can create these portals, and Chalkman confirms, explaining that emotions endure and can give rise to such paranormal phenomena. Inaba recalls a movie he saw with Jas where evil desires took the form of a monster called the ID, and he asks Chalkman if the ID can move. The owl explains that for that, it would need a vessel containing a large amount of emotions, as the ID is a powerful being that sometimes can have its own body. Meanwhile, in the teacher's lounge, Professor Miura is at his computer, exhausted by the female voices around him. A student enters and hands him some exams, but due to his pain, he drops them. When the student helps him and looks him in the face, he hears negative voices in his head and faints. Inaba, on his way there, sees the student being taken away in an ambulance and realizes that if the professor is possessed by an ID, he has a serious case on his hands. That night at the inn, Sato tells a story about how people in the past believed that those with mental problems were possessed by a fox, which led to their mistreatment. Sato used to fear what was different. Before dying, he gets up and tells Inaba that it's important to study in an unusual way. Inaba reflects on the weight of words and how people can see much more in them than one might think. While watching The Exorcist with Sato, Inaba thinks about what Sato said about studying ghosts seriously. Inaba is confused and doesn't know what to do but considers distancing himself. Then, the inn's phone rings, and Shiro informs him that he has obtained information about the professor and a photo showing a notable change in his appearance. The second photo shows the cover of an album titled Shirame Women's Preparatory School, and Toshiro explains that this school has a mixed reputation, and the professor resigned for personal reasons last year. Inaba and Toshiro conclude that something must have happened between the professor and the students at that school, leading to his drastic change. Inaba thinks that Professor Miura suffered at the hands of those students, and his pride and confidence were shattered, creating a room filled with hatred towards women. This led him to become the school counselor for the theater club, and the ID took shape from his revulsion towards women. Later, Inaba accompanies Toshiro to her home and reflects on how the professor fainted in the afternoon, indicating that he could attack at any moment. Suddenly, they hear a scream from Toshiro and rush to find the professor on top of her with a knife, in a terrifying and morbid situation. Inaba reacts quickly and uses the book to summon Blawa, the thunder god, causing an explosion that destroys everything around them. He then confronts Professor Miura, disarms him, and places him on the sidewalk so that the police believe he is just another victim and won't arrest him, as that would not solve the spectral problem. Inaba wakes up Toshiro and explains the situation. Although relieved that she did not see the professor's face, she calms down and suggests that the explosion was caused by a gas leak. The neighbors believe the professor was also a victim of the explosion. Inaba and Toshiro say goodbye, and on the way back to the inn, Inayurius informs Inaba that someone with a powerful aura has arrived at the inn. Inaba hurries and meets Akine, who asks why he went to find Toshiro first. He responds that the professor saw them together and that she is attractive and friendly with men. Akine continues to explain that Toshiro will be the ID's first victim, as she was the first woman to interact with the professor when the specter possessed him. Thus, the professor only goes insane when he sees her, making her a victim of the ID that will begin to devour her mind gradually. Therefore, our protagonist decides to help Miura at all costs. The next day, Inaba visits the clinic with flowers for Professor Miura. When he enters the professor's room, Miura asks if he has come on behalf of the students. While they talk, Toshiro peeks through the door and tells Inaba that she needs to make a call and heads to the rooftop. The professor's face changes terrifyingly upon seeing her and asks Inaba to get a vase for the flowers. The professor then heads to the rooftop, where he confronts Toshiro and strangles her. Inaba arrives just in time to see the ID leave Miura's body and enter Toshiro, her mouth opening in the most disturbing way until she becomes a paper-like figure. At that moment, it's revealed that it was all part of Akine's plan to trap the monster using a paper clone of Toshiro to lure and seal the monster. After the ID disappears, Professor Miura stands up, confused, and Akine advises him to forget everything. Akine explains that it's not so difficult to overcome his misogyny, as his past students falsely accused him of being a dirty violator, which ruined his reputation and pride. Upon hearing his sad story, Inaba decides that it's best to ignore him and leave him alone in the rain like a stray cat. The next day, Inaba meets Toshiro, who is concerned about his health. Inaba reflects on how expelling the ID doesn't make the professor a good person, it only returns him to his previous state in the classroom. He finds a note instructing him to go to the art room during lunch. In the art room, Inaba finds no one else and encounters the professor with a knife, determined to attack. Inaba asks the professor what's wrong and urges him not to be a coward. The professor responds that he won't leave and charges at him with murderous intent. Inaba uses the book again to summon Blois, but the expulsion is so powerful that it destroys the art room completely, causing the ceiling to collapse on Inaba. Seeing Inaba in trouble, Urius appears and uses a card called Goyelem to summon a stone golem that pulls him from the rubble. Inaba sees the professor on the ground and realizes that he is truly out of his mind and decides to leave him alone. Finally, our protagonist returns to his place, covered in bandages, fractures, and wounds, recovering a month later when everything returns to normal. The holidays arrive, and Inaba continues his training with Akine. However, it becomes difficult due to the cold water and pain in his body. Akine calls Kira to carry him like a princess and help him for a week. Inaba continues the training but finds it increasingly difficult. On the last day, he completes it without difficulties and feels his body full of power. However, he discovers that he has lost 10 kilograms and his body looks emaciated, which makes him lose his appetite. Akine suggests he rest and skip training for the day. Inaba thinks about Ishiki's words about losing oneself and believes he understands them. The next morning, Inaba decides to walk to clear his mind. He experiences a strange sensation that reminds him of difficult moments at his uncle's house, losing track of time. When he realizes it, it is already night. When he decides to return home, he finds his friends at the inn, including Kira and Ryu, who explain that they've had similar experiences. Kira mentions that she found help in painting, and Ryu says that worries, insecurities, and pain are good memories and reflects on what's missing. Inaba finally decides that he wants to be a mage. During the training with Akine, Inaba experiences a state of divine inspiration where his soul seems to rise to the sky. He sees the clouds and stars, and tears flow from the beauty of the moment. Akine pulls him out of his trance and explains that it's a sense of liberation and pleasure from overcoming his limits. Ryu appears and congratulates Inaba from outside. Inaba feels proud after the intense training. Ryu decides to reward him with a magical headbutt that grants him a spell known as the Third Eye, which enhances his supernatural perception. Or so Ishiki explains, as Inaba doesn't quite understand the explanation. The next day, the divination goddesses reveal to the protagonist that in this new semester, he will meet new people. Indeed, at school, the principal introduces two new teachers, Haruka Hoi, a somewhat pretentious and passive-aggressive teacher, and Naomi Chiaki, who will take over Inaba's class as a replacement for Professor Miura. For some strange reason, she constantly reprimands Inaba for how he dresses and acts in class. The students comment on the new teacher's appearances, especially how handsome Professor Chiaki is. The female students ask many questions and sigh for him. Toshiro asks if he is single, to which the professor responds that he is, but they must graduate if they want anything with him, which is a rather illegal answer. Later, Professor Haruka, who is easy to understand and seems serious and correct compared to Chiaki, is introduced. The principal also introduces a new student named Kanaxu Yamamoto. After class, the students plan an English club meeting and decide to watch an anime movie. Toshiro asks Kanaxu about her favorite anime movie, but she coldly responds and suggests watching a normal movie instead of anime, saying that anime is for otakus. Inaba shares what happened in class with his friends, and Ishiki warns him that Kanaxu might be hiding something and advises him to be careful with her. At school, Inaba and Tashiro arrive at the English club and see Kanaxu, who is the first to arrive. Gradually, other students join the meeting. Tashiro shows her friends a photo of the food prepared by Chef Din, but Kanaxu criticizes it and tells Tashiro not to call her by her first name, but by her last name Yamamoto. Everyone is surprised by her attitude. Then a boy arrives at the club with anime movies to liven up the mood and congratulates Tashiro, but she gets upset and leaves with the others. While watching the anime movies, Tashiro says a word in English, and Kanaxu corrects her to mock her in a typical annoying manner. Everyone is impressed by her attitude, and Tashiro mocks Kanaxu's English. Inaba, seeing the argument, decides to take Tashiro away and ignore Kanaxu. She can't stand it anymore and shouts at Inaba for ignoring her. Everyone in the club is startled by Kanaxu's attitude and stands behind Inaba. Got it! Here's the dynamic, young writer's version in English. In the English club, everyone's gearing up for the school festival, but they notice that Kanaku has been missing for several days. Outside, it starts raining, and that's when we see Kaku walking in the rain, clearly harboring some major grudge against the English club. Days later, in the school hallway, Nava takes notes with Aksu, who's reading. Professor Haruka calls the girl over to join Aksu, making Aksu uncomfortable due to the professor's presence. Inaba accompanies her, and during their chat, the professor mentions knowing about Inaba's deceased parents, telling him that they must be proud of him and that he's not the only one suffering. Despite these words of encouragement, Inaba feels irritated by the professor's intrusion into his personal life. When Inaba arrives in the classroom, Tashiro tells him that Professor Haruka also scolded him, albeit passively-aggressively, for interacting with Professor Chaki. And as if that weren't enough, right then, Professor Haruka shows up to give Inaba an English dictionary. Seeing the professor's poor demeanor, Inaba assumes she couldn't afford even a measly book and explodes in frustration. The professor, however, responds with more encouragement, only serving to irritate Inaba further. Inaba remains upset, shouting that he doesn't want anyone to pity him or dwell on his disadvantages. His mood shifts, though, when he receives a letter from his friend Jay. At dinner, Sato comments that Professor Haruka does good things, but Inaba feels uncomfortable with her habit of acting without truly knowing people. Back at the prep school, the English club is almost ready for the festival. Yamamoto arrives, sits down to read, and the president scolds him for not participating as part of the club if he's going to be there. Yamamoto responds with indifference, which angers the president. When Na tries to intervene, the president tells him if he doesn't want to participate, he shouldn't come back until the festival is over. Yamamoto leaves in tears, and Professor Haruka intervenes, reprimanding the club members for their treatment of her and accusing them of being bullies. The insistence of Haruka doesn't end there, though. At a moment when Inaba is talking with Chaki, Haruka reappears, treating Inaba as a miserable person for having no parents and living alone in a boarding house. Hearing this, Chaki defends Inaba, showing Haruka that he looks and dresses like a completely normal and healthy student. This reveals that Haruka had a flawed perception of Inaba just because he's an orphan. Inaba realizes that Chaki's scoldings were meant to protect him, believing Chaki to be a good person. The next day, at the prep school, Chaki informs the students that the cultural festival is approaching and they need to decide on their activities. Inaba feels the responsibility to live up to Chaki's trust. In the classroom, Inaba decides to organize a demon fighting game. During the break, the club president is set to decide what they'll do for the festival, while the students debate. Inaba reflects on Yamamoto and her attitude. Tashiro notices his concern and asks if something's wrong. Inaba mentions he hasn't seen Yamamoto since the incident. Tashiro investigates and discovers that Yamamoto previously attended Jin Mei Academy, a famous institution where she also acted out. Her parents were called in due to her behavior, and after their intervention, she stopped attending due to feeling overshadowed by her perfect sister. After this revelation, Inaba heads to the teacher's lounge to find Chaki, but Professor Haruka arrives and interrupts. Chaki decides to take Inaba aside to talk privately. He explains his situation with Yamamoto and asks if Chaki has any ideas on how to resolve it. Chaki responds that the future depends on each person's choices, and they part ways when the bell rings. Afterward, Inaba approaches Yamamoto, asking her to prepare a proposal for the festival, which is really just an excuse to try to integrate her into the group. However, she treats him poorly. The next day, Yamamoto tries to join the club to present a proposal, but when she sees all the happy club members, she changes her mind, tearing up the proposal and leaving angrily, clearly struggling with low self-esteem. But let's put this school drama aside for a moment and head back to the inn, where Antiquario shows his friends a new acquisition, a projector shaped like a lamp capable of displaying dimensions as if in virtual reality. He asks Kind to create a barrier, which she does, though it doesn't bode well. Everyone gathers, and Antiquario reveals different worlds through the lamp, from dinosaurs to places humans have never seen. At that moment, the barrier breaks, and a strange figure dressed like a smith appears. Inaba is uncomfortable with the figure's presence. He sees Jas protecting Kari while she cries, and Inaba launches an attack at the stranger, but it's stopped. Antiquario defends Inaba, asking the stranger to leave and warning him about the consequences of facing him. The stranger questions if they're threatening him, and Antiquario requests respect due to his status. This sparks an intense battle between Antiquario and his aides versus the stranger, who turns out to be stronger than them. Antiquario decides to remove his eye patch and use Flash, like a Pokemon, to send Inaba and the others back, promising to meet again after this strange incident where it seems Antiquario sacrifices himself for the team. Our friends are returned to the inn, and the librarian explains to Inaba that the stranger is a miracle hunter, while Kind mentions they work for a secret church dealing with exorcisms, ghosts, and other paranormal phenomena, keeping their activities under wraps. Afterward, Jay says goodbye to Inaba, and then the librarian informs him that a package has arrived, brought by the waterfall. There, Inaba sees the chief doctor of Kind. The librarian explains that he got an elixir of immortality, but it turned out to be empty, so he gives the container to Inaba. Back at the prep school, Yaba faces his first exam and knows he didn't do well. However, his worries fade when he sees Chalky catching a student for cheating with their phone, showing an unusual seriousness for the usually cheerful professor. This scares Inaba a bit. Things get tenser when Chalky calls a student assembly, revealing he feels betrayed by the students who cheated with their phones. His aggression makes the students who previously admired him start to fear him. He's so harsh that even Juka reprimands him, which is significant given her character, but Chalky treats her even worse, accusing her of being nosy. The students demand that he apologize to the professor, causing a commotion. To try and stop the ruckus, Inaba uses Urias to knock the microphone out of Chalky's hands, startling everyone with the noise. Just when things are about to get worse, Camilla, the student council president, appears, restoring order and apologizing to the professor on behalf of all the students for betraying his trust. Finally, both sides calm down, though Chalky has earned the resentment of many students who once admired him, which might be important later. With only 10 days left for the cultural festival, Inaba is worried but continues to help with preparations. Meanwhile, Yamamoto is outside the classroom, reading a book, frustrated with what's happening in the halls. Professor Juka notices Yamamoto and realizes she's going through a tough time but isn't sure how to help. Inaba and Tashiro head to the English club, but Camilla stops them to ask for help with a problem related to Professor Chalky, whose relationship with the students has worsened since the assembly. Camilla approaches Tashiro for information on the professor. Back at the inn, Inaba encounters a character dressed as Sailor Moon. However, neither the skirt, the tight outfit, nor the moon prism capture Inaba's interest. Back at the prep school, Inaba escapes his responsibilities in the club to go up to the rooftop, where he finds Professor Chalky and notices something strange on his chest, similar to when Tashiro had an accident. Seeing Chalky in pain, Inaba decides to use his powers to try and heal him, but Chalky stops him, pulling away because the contact felt oddly prolonged and uncomfortable. At that moment, Chalky explains that he suffers from anemia and is at his limit due to his work as a professor. Returning to almost nothing, Inaba continues to think about what happened to Chalky and the pressure he's under. Suddenly, he feels dizzy and loses consciousness. When he wakes up, he's at the inn with Kind, who explains he was in danger trying to absorb Chalky's anemia. Kind mentions a strange connection between them, but Inaba thinks it was just a coincidence. The next day, in the school hallways, Professor Juka meets Yamamoto, who is heading to the club practice room. The club president is excited and asks Yamamoto if she'll participate, but she mocks the script and arrogantly resigns from the club. Yamamoto's reaction surprises the students, and things get worse when she lashes out at Inaba, saying it was pathetic to brag about his mother's cooking. Tashiro reacts to Yamamoto's insults, slapping her to the ground, telling her that her family problems don't give her the right to disrespect others and that Inaba's mother is dead. Yamamoto explodes in jealous and furious rage, asking Inaba what makes him special. Inaba tries to calm the situation but senses a dark aura of jealousy and rage from Yamamoto. At that moment, Professor Juka arrives and apologizes for the situation, but the students are unhappy with her intervention. The club president tells Yamamoto that they can't pretend to be friends and that the club isn't a daycare. Haruka takes Yamamoto away, and the president decides to continue with the festival preparations. In the hallway, Yaba notices that Yamamoto seems calmer and might have needed someone like Haruka. Back at the inn, Yaba prepares for the festival and says goodbye to the residents. Later, at the prep school, he brings food for all the club members before the festival starts. While searching for Professor Chalky, Yaba feels a pang of pain, runs to find the professor, and discovers he's injured his arm. Inaba uses his book and summons the poisonous scorpion protector of the moon to track down the responsible girl. He identifies her and suspects Juka might have sent her to attack the professor. However, the girl explains she did it because Chalky spoke badly of the professor, showing her twisted reasoning. Inaba takes the X-Acto knife from Chalky and tells the girl he'll give it to the teachers and that she should face the consequences of her actions. The girl runs away, and Inaba returns to the injured professor, observing the damage is more severe than he thought, knowing anemia could make even a simple cut fatal. In desperation, Inaba shakes the container that supposedly held the elixir and miraculously, the last drop falls on Chalky, saving him when it seemed all hope was lost. Afterward, the professor wakes up, not remembering what happened and thinking he just fainted. The festival is about to start, and while Inaba arranges things, he hears the voices of Ishiki, Akine, and Jay greeting him. Yes, his monster pals are enjoying the festival too. During the event, Inaba hears that the English club president is planning something, but he's unsure what. Tashiro approaches but refuses to reveal details. The English play begins, and everyone is proud of Inaba and his constant effort. Suddenly, a trio of rebellious students overhears the president talking with Professor Chalky during the festival. As the festival reaches its climax, the lights unexpectedly go out, and Inaba rushes to find out what's happening, with Tashiro and the president following. The and friends also arrive to help, discovering the rebels cut the cables and are proud of it. But soon, everything returns to normal. Meanwhile, Professor Chalky takes the stage and starts singing. Inaba's ghostly friends join in to help with the music, and Inaba also contributes with his book and cards to support the performance, wrapping up the festival successfully. Christmas arrives, and Inaba runs into several characters from the series, starting with Takanaka, who's seen at his new job, carrying boxes of bottles. This makes Inaba remember Akira's words about how people can reform or not, and it could be a matter of destiny. Inaba meets his cousin, who scolds him for not visiting during Christmas. Nervously, Inaba responds that he's been busy and plans to visit his relatives during the spring break. Days pass, and the new year arrives, bringing excitement to Yaba, Jay, and Kari, who begin to play in the snow. They discover several igloos, and at that moment, Nyo appears to explain that they're time igloos that can show the past, present, and future. Yes, everything in this anime has to be magical. Inaba and Jay venture into the time igloos, exploring 2 from the past and 1 from the future. Inaba sees his future, traveling the world with the librarian, a fate he finds unappealing and assumes must be a mistake. Meanwhile, Jay sees a bright future, including Tashiro as his assistant in a successful company. Inaba returns to the igloo and tries to change his future, managing to open a dimensional rift and getting trapped in the flow of time. They realize they could be stuck forever if they don't do something. Inaba uses the book to return home, and Kari's crying makes the book react, asking the hippogriff to take them back to their world. They manage to return safely. Back home, they find Art and his friends worried about them. During a bath, Antiquario, who fortunately is still alive, explains that each time igloo shows possible futures based on decisions made. Jay adds that he can't imagine a future without his friend Yaba. The sun rises at the waterfall, marking the start of a new year. Inaba feels content with the uncertainty of his future, knowing that the Monster Inn will always be his home. And that's a wrap on Elegant Yokai Apartment Life, the anime that teaches us renting cheap can be costly. But hey, it's not like our protagonist missed out on the death deal offer. And there you have it, folks. Elegant Yokai Apartment Life is the perfect blend of comedy, magic, and touching moments that shows even the most elegant apartments can have a supernatural twist. If you enjoyed this recap, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Also, follow me on Instagram and Twitter for more fun content and updates. See you next time, and remember, the best home is where yokai make you feel welcome.